It was a quiet Thursday evening, the kind that feels normal until your world shatters. Marcus James was driving home, hands tight on the steering wheel, the hum of the engine filling the empty streets. His mind wandered to his family, his daughter's dance recital, his wife's smile, the ordinary joys he held dear. And then, flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Panic bubbled in his chest. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because he knew the world had long judged him as guilty before a single word left his mouth. Officer Reynolds approached, his face set in a scowl. "License and registration," he barked, his voice cold. Marcus handed him over, eyes calm but wary. The tension was palpable, like electricity in the air before a storm. Sweat trickled down his temple as Reynolds leaned closer, peering at him with suspicion, disdain, judgment. A casual observer might have seen a routine stop, but Marcus knew better. Every stare, every tone carried the weight of prejudice, a history of being profiled, of being underestimated, of being feared simply because of his skin. And tonight, the street they were on would become more than just asphalt. It would become a stage for confrontation, revelation, and accountability. The officer circled Marcus' car slowly, his steps deliberate, heavy, almost theatrical. Every motion carried suspicion, as if he was inspecting a criminal who had already confessed in the officer's mind. Marcus kept his hands visible on the wheel, fingers slightly trembling, not from fear of the law, but from the tension that came with knowing the world already judged him guilty. "You live around here?" Reynolds asked, his voice sharp, clipped each word laced with doubt. Marcus answered politely, his tone steady, measured, trying to mask the adrenaline surging through him. He gave his address, explained the route he had taken to get home, all the while noticing the subtle ways the officer's gaze lingered, too long, too hard, on his skin, on his eyes, on his posture. It wasn't just a routine question. Marcus could feel the underlying accusation in the air. "Why are you here? What are you doing? You don't belong." Every syllable felt like an invisible hand pressing against his chest. Around them, the neighborhood seemed to hush itself, as if even the houses were holding their breath, waiting to see what would unfold. The streetlights cast long shadows over the asphalt, exaggerating the distance between them and creating an atmosphere of looming confrontation. Marcus knew that arguing, questioning, or resisting could escalate the situation, so he remained silent when the officer continued to circle the car, his eyes scanning, judging, measuring. The world had taught Marcus to navigate this dance of suspicion from a young age. He had memorized every word to say, every gesture to make, every tone to adopt, all to survive encounters like this one. His pulse was steady on the surface, but beneath it a storm of frustration, indignation, and quiet fury raged. This was not about breaking any law. It was about someone projecting fear and prejudice onto him simply because of the color of his skin, because of society's narratives that turned ordinary men into threats. Marcus felt the weight of history in that moment. The countless black men and women who had faced similar scrutiny, who had been harassed, humiliated, or harmed simply for existing. Every second stretched, heavy and oppressive, each question from Reynolds like a test he had no choice but to pass. Marcus's eyes met the officer's briefly, searching for any sign of reason, humanity, understanding, but all he saw was suspicion reinforced by unspoken bias, a mirror of the assumptions society had loaded onto him before he ever stepped onto the street. Reynolds' voice grew sharper, more insistent, each question landing like a hammer against the fragile calm Marcus fought to maintain. "Where are you headed?" he demanded, leaning closer, eyes narrowing as though trying to read some hidden agenda in Marcus' face. Marcus answered carefully, his words even and deliberate, revealing nothing but the truth. Every syllable felt heavy, loaded with the knowledge that nothing he could say would erase the assumptions already lodged in the officer's mind. "Why are you out so late?" Reynolds pressed, his tone laced with suspicion, as if simply existing in the evening hours was a crime for someone like Marcus. The street was quiet, too quiet, amplifying the tension in a way that made Marcus acutely aware of every sound: the hum of a distant car engine, the whisper of leaves stirred by a faint breeze, the faint creak of a nearby porch swing. Every movement, every breath was exaggerated in the stillness. Marcus kept his hands visible, controlled, but inside, his chest tightened with the familiar burn of frustration. This was more than a routine stop. It was a display of power, a test that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with prejudice. He noticed the subtle cues, the way Reynolds' shoulders tensed, the slight twitch in his jaw, the impatience in his stare. Each gesture communicated the unspoken accusation. "I don't trust you. I'm waiting for you to slip up." Marcus felt the weight of centuries of systemic bias pressing down on him, the invisible chains of history that followed every black man, Every black woman, every person who had to navigate a world that measured worth by skin tone. A few neighbors peeked from behind curtains, sensing tension but hesitant to intervene. Their silence mirrored the societal complicity Marcus had experienced countless times before, people watching but unwilling to challenge the injustice. Marcus reminded himself to stay calm, to maintain control over his voice, over his movements, over the narrative that the officer was trying to write for him. The officer's questions continued, repetitive and probing, designed to intimidate, to unsettle, to provoke a reaction that could be misconstrued. Marcus could feel the sweat forming along his hairline, not from exertion, but from the tightrope of survival he walked every day. He remembered stories of men like him, friends, strangers who had faced the same scrutiny, who had been treated as dangerous by mere association with a color they never chose. Each question, each glare, each subtle movement reinforced a truth he had known all his life: innocence mattered less than perception. Reynolds' hand hovered near his holster, subtle but unmistakable, a silent reminder of the power he assumed he held. Marcus felt it as a pressure on the air itself, the kind of threat that didn't need words to communicate danger. He kept his posture calm, measured, but his mind was alert, analyzing every twitch, every glance, every micro-expression that could hint at escalation. He had been in situations like this before, and he knew the delicate balance of survival, how one misstep, one wrong inflection could turn suspicion into confrontation, confrontation into tragedy. Marcus's eyes met Reynolds', steady and unwavering. He could see the officer's certainty, the confidence rooted in bias, but he also noticed the tiny cracks, the subtle uncertainty that bubbled beneath the surface when faced with someone who refused to fit the stereotype. Marcus took a slow breath, letting the weight of the moment settle, the tension thick as fog between them. And then he spoke, his voice calm but firm, carrying authority without aggression. "Officer," he said, drawing Reynolds' gaze fully onto him, "I'm Marcus James, head of internal affairs for this precinct." The words struck like lightning, sudden and unexpected. Reynolds froze mid-motion, his mouth opening slightly, as if trying to speak but unable to form the words. Marcus could see the gears turning in his mind, the disbelief, the confusion, the dawning realization that the man he assumed powerless, the man he judged before even knowing him, was the one with the authority to hold him accountable. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The tension shifted, the air vibrating with the unspoken recognition of error, of misplaced assumptions, of a worldview built on fear rather than truth. Marcus watched closely as Reynolds' eyes darted, scanning, searching for a way to reclaim control, to reassert dominance, to mask the embarrassment that now crept across his face. But the moment was fragile, delicate, a mirror reflecting the officer's bias in stark clarity. Marcus remained composed, letting the revelation settle in fully, allowing the weight of responsibility and accountability to land where it belonged. Every gesture, every blink, every subtle shift in posture spoke volumes. Reynolds was no longer in the position of unquestioned authority. In that instant, Marcus realized something profound. The encounter was no longer about him personally. It was about the silent lessons embedded in every act of prejudice, the consequences that arise when assumptions replace knowledge, when fear replaces humanity. He could feel the history of systemic injustice reverberating in that brief exchange, the echoes of countless interactions where bias went unchecked, where power was abused, where human dignity was disregarded. The street suddenly felt smaller, claustrophobic, as if the world itself was pressing in around them. Reynolds' hands fumbled slightly with the paperwork in his grasp, the confident posture he had carried moments ago beginning to crumble. Marcus watched every subtle gesture, the tightness in his jaw, the nervous shuffle of his boots, the way his eyes avoided direct contact for more than a second. Pride and authority, once unquestioned, had dissolved into awkwardness and the faintest hint of fear. It wasn't fear of Marcus, not in the way he assumed. It was fear of accountability, fear of the consequences that came with confronting one's own prejudices. Marcus could feel the weight of this moment, the gravity of years of injustice condensed into a single encounter. The officer, who had approached him with suspicion and assumptions, was now confronted with a reality he had not anticipated. Marcus's presence, calm but unwavering, had disrupted the narrative Reynolds had constructed in his mind, the narrative that allowed him to see a black man as inherently suspicious. Every instinct the officer had relied on, the bias he had nurtured, the judgments he had owned over years, was suddenly rendered unreliable, exposed. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unsaid words. Marcus didn't raise his voice or gesture aggressively. He let the truth of his position speak for itself. He could see the internal conflict flicker in Reynolds' eyes, the clash between ego, habit, and the sudden confrontation with reality. Marcus knew that humiliation was not the lesson he wanted to deliver, but rather awareness, a rare and fragile understanding that the systems and attitudes surrounding them often perpetuated harm. Around them, the neighborhood remained still, the quiet echoing the intensity of the moment. Marcus felt a surge of empathy, not for Reynolds, but for the larger human condition, for the patterns of bias that ensnared even those sworn to protect. He recognized the difficulty of challenging assumptions, the discomfort of facing one's own complicity in a system that rewards suspicion over fairness, fear over humanity. Yet, Marcus also recognized the power inherent in this exchange, the power to shift perspective even in a brief encounter, to plant a seed of accountability where ignorance had once reigned. Every breath Marcus took was deliberate, controlled, steadying both himself and the narrative of the moment. He could see Reynolds trying to recover composure, to regain the authority he assumed he had, but it was fleeting. The officer's posture remained slightly off balance, his gestures hesitant, his eyes no longer sharp and commanding, but cautious, uncertain. Marcus understood this, the fragile transition from blind certainty to hesitant recognition, and he allowed it to unfold fully, silently observing the weight of reality pressing against years of unchallenged assumptions. Marcus's voice remained calm, measured, but it carried weight, a quiet authority that filled the space between them. "We all have a responsibility to see people, not stereotypes," he said, his words deliberate, each one landing with purpose. Reynolds' eyes flickered, the hesitation clear, the tension in his body betraying the internal reckoning taking place. For a moment, the world seemed suspended, the ordinary street transformed into a theater of realization, where assumptions were confronted and the subtle, corrosive poison of bias was laid bare. Marcus didn't raise his voice, didn't issue ultimatums or threats. His presence alone, steady, unyielding, spoke volumes about dignity, resilience, and the quiet power of truth. Reynolds swallowed, his hands clenching and unclenching, the papers trembling slightly in his grasp. Marcus could see the internal dialogue racing behind his eyes, the embarrassment, the sudden understanding, the fear of having been wrong. For someone trained to exercise authority, to assume control, the revelation that the man he had deemed suspicious held the very power to oversee him was a seismic shift. Marcus observed carefully, noting the subtle gestures, the straightening of shoulders, the clearing of a throat, the way Reynolds' eyes darted, almost searching for a lifeline in a moment where none existed. The air between them was thick with unspoken acknowledgement. Marcus could sense the struggle in Reynolds' mind, the attempt to reconcile years of ingrained assumptions with a reality he hadn't anticipated. There was no quick fix, no immediate absolution, just a moment raw and unfiltered, where recognition and accountability collided. Marcus felt the weight of this encounter, the gravity of representing not only himself, but the countless others who had been judged, stopped, or harassed without cause. His calmness, his measured tone, became a mirror, reflecting disparity between perception and truth, between fear and understanding. Marcus's gaze softened slightly, not in pity, but in quiet assertion of his humanity. The officer's hesitation lingered, the tension palpable, a testament to the entrenched patterns of bias and the long road toward awareness. Marcus handed back the officer's paperwork, his movements deliberate, controlled, every gesture signaling that while the lesson had been delivered, it was up to Reynolds to internalize it, to confront his own assumptions, to reflect on the subtle ways prejudice had guided his actions. There was no triumph in Marcus' demeanor, no gloating, only the steady, unwavering presence of someone who had faced prejudice countless times and knew how to confront it with dignity. As Marcus prepared to step back, he sensed the shift, however small, in the energy between them. The officer's stance was no longer commanding, it was tentative, measured, uncertain. Marcus understood the significance of this pause, the quiet impact of accountability, and he allowed it to unfold, observing the delicate process of self-realization as it began to take hold in a mind unaccustomed to scrutiny and reflection. That night, Marcus drove home with a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that the encounter ended without escalation. Sorrow because the incident was not unique. It was a reflection of the broader reality faced by countless people every day. A single moment, one traffic stop, revealed the insidious way bias and discrimination permeate our lives. Marcus thought of his daughter, of the lessons he hoped to impart. Not just about courage or law, but about seeing the humanity in every person. The world would not change overnight, but moments like this mattered. They cracked open the door to reflection, to accountability, to recognition of the harm done when assumptions replace understanding. Marcus knew his story would stay with Reynolds forever, a reminder that every act of prejudice carries consequences, that justice is not abstract, it is lived, witnessed, and demanded. And for those watching was a mirror, How often do we judge without knowing? How often do we act on fear rather than truth? This was more than a stop on a darkened street. It was a lesson in the human heart, in the weight of our choices, and in the power of seeing one another as more than a stereotype.